Hello, everyone. How are you this evening?
Good, Professor. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you, Sean. So, where did we leave off last time? I know it's been a while.
The last thing I wrote down was that Washington established American neutrality in the France versus England War.
Okay, good. That's good. And okay, so now I have this annoying habit. Lizette answers the question, then immediately I ask another one. Does anyone have anything different? Before I start grilling Lizette on the implications of neutrality and other things you remember. Okay, so was everyone pretty happy with that? France said, okay, that's cool. You don't want to help us out, even though we help you out. We understand you have your own issues. And here at home, people who were wearing the tricolor and were toasting the French Revolution, they said, yeah, it's a good thing we're staying neutral because otherwise we might be dragged into the war. And we agree we shouldn't be trying to upset the British monarchy or doing other things that might be bad in the long run. Can anyone anticipate any reaction to this aside from
Wasn't there that French minister who came and tried to recruit a bunch of privateers?
Yeah, there was Citizen Genet. Yeah, he came. He tries to recruit privateers to help out. And yeah, that's certainly something that happened. Good thing, bad thing?
In Washington's view, it was bad because he got banned. He had to go back to France.
Well, Washington wanted him to go back to France, but Citizen Genet thought better of that option. He winds up staying here, but no longer as the French minister. So can you anticipate any political reaction at home from the neutrality proclamation?
I feel like people are gonna have really mixed views about it. I don't think everybody's gonna be in support of it. I feel like there's gonna be a lot of people who feel like they're obligated to help France because they helped us. And I also feel like France is not gonna be the most accepting of that. We stay neutral. I feel like they're gonna be a little mad at us too.
Yeah, I can anticipate that. And it's not just because they're French that they'll be miffed with this turn of events. So good. Okay. So you're right. There is a reaction. And one of the reactions, of course, is that James Madison writes a series of political essays saying that the president doesn't have the power to declare neutrality because Congress can declare war, therefore only Congress can declare that we're not at war. What do you make of that argument?
I mean, it kind of makes sense.
Okay, it does kind of make sense. I have to say when Madison writes something, generally, yes, it is going to make sense in some way. So did Washington say, I never really thought of it that way, you're right? Or do you think Washington is going to have a different point of view on whether the president has the prerogative to set American foreign policy?
I think he would have said he has a different point of view.
Yeah, it's safe to say he does. And in fact, it's best articulated really by Alexander Hamilton. So Madison writes his essays under the name Helvetius. And Helvetius was one of these ancient Greek Roman philosophers who wrote a lot about this. And Hamilton writes a series of essays under the name of Pacificus. That is, I hope you know what Pacific means, and saying that it is the president's prerogative to set foreign policy. The important thing here is none of this had been decided yet. That's one of the important things here. So you have an argument over this fundamental issue about whose prerogative it is. And you also have these two guys who just 5 years earlier had been co-writing the Federalist essays in support of the Constitution, disagreeing about what the Constitution means as far as executive power goes. And a lot of this is colored not by, theories about who best should be wielding executive power, but over politics, who wants to wield it and what policy we should have toward the French. Now, at the meantime, there's another big problem here for the Washington administration, and that's one I really haven't spoken too much about because, surprisingly enough, and this, of course, is the debt. The United States, as you probably recall, was heavily in debt as a result of the Revolutionary War. And one of the things that Secretary of the Treasury Hamilton does is figure out what is the public credit. That is, how much does the United States owe as a result of the revolution? And he combines this how shall we put it? He combines this assessment of the federal debt with the state Revolutionary War debt. And altogether, it's about $42 million in 1790 money. And Hamilton figures that, well, of course, the priority is getting the United States out of debt. And there are a number of ways you can do this. By the way, debt is a big problem still for or I should say, again, for the United States. And you all are going to be spending much of your lives grappling with this issue of the debt. So it might be instructive just to look at what different methods were tried. I should say that this was the preoccupation of Hamilton, and it becomes the preoccupation of the Jefferson administration, how to pay off the national debt. And Hamilton's big concern is that the United States be able to borrow money again. So you're not simply paying off the debt to pay off the debt. You're making steps toward paying off the debt so that creditors will advance more money if you need it. They have somewhat different ideas about whether debt is a good thing or a bad thing. Jefferson, Madison thought debt was a bad thing. Hamilton thought, well, debt is a thing and it can be used in different ways. So the big thing the United States has to do is show that it is serious about paying its creditors. People loan money because they expect to get interest. So the United States has to make interest payments every year. This is why it's a bad thing for you to be too heavily in debt. But those who loan money like you to be in debt because then you're paying them a monthly fee to support the debt. If you pay off your credit card balance every month, you're not the customer the credit card company really likes. They like the ones who have a big balance and they pay a small amount every month because then that small amount keeps coming. So you have this big debt, and Hamilton wants the federal government, that is the United States, to assume all of the Revolutionary War debt of the states. Now, some states had already paid off their debt, like Virginia, and Virginia doesn't understand why now it has to help pay off the war debt of states like Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, which had not yet paid off their debt. So there is that political issue here. Plus, the Virginians tended to have a different view of debt than Hamilton did. So you have that whole issue. And then the other one is, how are you going to pay this debt? And if you are going to have to make annual payments, you're going to need a source of revenue. And the primary source of revenue for the United States was the tariff, that is, taxes on imports. And Hamilton reasoned that the people who are paying the tariffs, that is, the merchants who are importing stuff, already are pretty much committed to the government of the United States. You really want other people to be committed to supporting the government of the United States. And you also need an additional source of revenue. So at the same time as Hamilton proposed assuming all the debts, he also proposes that the federal government impose an excise tax on whiskey. Excise taxes are extra taxes that are imposed for some good. Now, for example, if you own an automobile in Massachusetts, you pay an excise tax, usually to your town or city, whether the town or city does anything for your car or not. Every year you pay an excise tax. And in this case, they're paying an excise tax on whiskey. This isn't taxable to the people who are drinking whiskey, but to the people who are manufacturing it. And this is corn whiskey made obviously out of corn. Typically in the western areas, if you're a farmer out in western Pennsylvania growing corn, you have limited options to what you can do with the corn. One is you can feed it to hogs and then take the hogs down the river to New Orleans and sell them, or try to sell them to someone else. The problem you have in western Pennsylvania is everyone there pretty much has all the corn they can use and all the hogs they can use. So you have to find a market somewhere else. The other thing you can do with corn is turn it into whiskey. And whiskey has the advantage over hogs in that it's easy to transport and you can sell it just about anywhere. Now, for example, if I were to ask you as a group, is anyone here interested in this hog I've been raising? Is anyone interested? You can raise your hand if you are. Okay, Jake says, yeah, he might be interested in the hog. Can I get a show of hands if anyone is interested in the gallon of whiskey I have manufactured out of the corn? Sean also raised his hand for the hog. That's actually a better return than I've gotten in many a day. And fortunately, Sean and Jake, I have 2 hogs. I should have had a bidding war between you and then revealed the second hog at the last minute. Gallon of whiskey. Anyone see a potential market for? No, Lucetta's hand immediately went up. By the way, I'm not encouraging the use of alcohol. The deans warned me about that. So I forgot I had hit the record button already. So whiskey is marketable. And so the Treasury Department is going to impose a tax, or the federal government is going to impose a tax on whiskey. And how do you determine how much whiskey someone has produced? Well, what you'll do is measure the still. And a still is how you manufacture whiskey with a still. The deans also told me not to go through the process of manufacturing whiskey with a class. It seems to set a bad example. But you have people bring their corn to the guy who has the still. The still is often in the backwoods because it requires fire to make the still go. And you don't necessarily want this right next to your house because it's a dirty process. You squeeze the juice out of the corn and you put this mash into the still, and it's a process then of refining it, turning it into whiskey. And so a still doesn't, you're not going to be making a gallon of whiskey every year. If you have a still, you're probably going to manufacture more whiskey. Everyone doesn't have his or her own still. A still is a capital investment. And then you have to create it, then you have to maintain it. And a still can operate. And so let's say the still that Lisette has can produce 10 gallons of whiskey in a week. So that means over the course of a year, you can do the arithmetic and figure out how much whiskey she can produce in a year. And our estimate is, how much whiskey are you producing every year, Lisette?
520.
520 gallons a year. Okay, good. So that's what we'll tax you on. Is that how much you're actually producing? 520 gallons a year? No, you're just producing like 10 gallons a year for your own personal use, right? And, how do we know? In order for us to find out, us being the federal government, we have to send agents out to inspect stills. So are you going to let us come and look at your still? No, of course not. Yeah, first rule. So, and what happens in Western Pennsylvania when these agents go out, want to inspect the stills, people drive them off their land. I mean, what right do these people have to come on our land? Didn't we just fight a revolution about this? And so you have this problem. And then the guy there's a number of interesting characters in Pittsburgh who are involved in this. And they wind up having their houses attacked, and they are hung in effigy. As people are saying, they have no right to tax us in this way because we are not really represented. The excise tax is imposed on us by this distant government. And what right do they have to tax us? And you have the folks in the West think the government on the East Coast is not really representative of us. Our representatives voted against this tax on whiskey, but it passed anyway. And it's an unfair burden on us. What would you do if you're President Washington, and you have these guys out in Western Pennsylvania saying, we don't want to pay the whiskey tax because we don't feel we were properly represented at the federal level. I should say I got a little ahead of myself with this whole story of resistance to the tax. And just for some reason, when I start talking about whiskey and taxes, I get very excited and lose track of where we are with this whole story, this whole sordid saga.
I suppose you could, Washington could, send someone to talk to them, but, sort of kick the can down the road on actually giving them anything.
Yeah, okay, I like your turn of phrase. Send someone out to talk to them. This is, of course, one problem Washington has. Another problem also in the West is this. I mentioned how much debt the United States had. And between 1790 and 96, every year, the federal government spent something like $5 million on operations. It spends about $7 or $8 million on the interest on the debt. And 5/6 of that operating budget, so about $4.5 million every year, is spent trying to fight the Miami Indians. And I think I mentioned a while ago, in 1790, Pennsylvania and Kentucky had sent their militia into Ohio to attack the Miami Indians. And the Miami Indians were led by Little Turtle, who was a warrior. And the Pennsylvania and Kentucky militia in 1790 go out to try to drive the Miami out and secure the frontier so more people can move from Western Pennsylvania into the Ohio River territory, very rich territory out here. And the Miami wind up driving these guys out. They attack the militia and drive them out. So the following year, the Washington administration knows it has to do something about the Miami Indians. So the government sends Arthur St. Clair, a Revolutionary War general, along with 1,400 militia and regulars, a much bigger force than Kentucky and Pennsylvania had sent out. And on November the 4th of 1791, Little Turtle and his forces attack St. Clair and kill 931 of the 1,400 men sent out to attack the Indians. This is actually one of the worst defeats the Army has ever suffered. And here you see these farmers in Western Pennsylvania are scratching their heads saying, well, wait a minute. The federal government is taxing us, but it's not protecting us. It's sending out these troops who get killed by the Indians. Why should we be supporting them in this way? And on the East Coast, the proponents of the tax say, well, the real problem here, the reason we're having trouble with the Miami Indians is because of all of these yahoos from the West moving out into the Miami Indians territory. And that's why the Indians are attacking them. And the real problem wasn't so much Arthur St. Clair, and St. Clair really wasn't that well prepared for it. Washington had warned him about surprise attacks and so on. Washington, remember, back in 1755 had been attacked by Indians out in the Western territory. It's a lesson he never forgot. And they said the real problem was the militia. The militia were incompetent. And so you have these Westerners who simply want to be drinking, manufacturing whiskey, drinking it, don't want to do anything to protect themselves. And they also don't want to have to pay taxes to help support all of this. So you have this conflict going on East versus West in two ways. One is over the excise tax, and the other is over the war against the Indians. And as I said, Congress in 1791 passes the excise tax, and out West there are protests. In fact, the tax collectors, the guys coming to inspect and collect the tax, get tarred and feathered and driven out of the area. And this, of course, forces the Washington administration to do something about this. The Washington administration has to do two things. Well, it has to do a lot of things simultaneously. If any of you is ever elected president, you'll find out that you have to do a lot of things simultaneously. So the administration has to figure out what to do about the Miami Indians. what to do about these farmers out in Western Pennsylvania. And then, of course, also has to figure out what to do about the British who still are in the Ohio River Territory. One reason the Miami are able to attack so easily is the British are maintaining their forts in Ohio and Michigan and Illinois and arming the Indians out there. And the Indians know they have support from the British. So you have all of these things happening simultaneously. And what the Washington administration does is this. It sends a bigger force out to fight the Indians. This one is led by Mad Anthony Wayne, and he doesn't make the same mistakes that St. Clair did or Harmer did. Harmer was a leader of the Kentucky militia. Secondly, the administration also recognizes it needs to do something to assert its authority in Western Pennsylvania. You have these guys tarring and feathering revenue collectors and refusing to pay their taxes. And the administration decides to send an army of 12,000 men out to put down the rebellion, a rebellion we know of as the Whiskey Rebellion. Of course, this is about 10 times the number that the federal government had sent to fight the Indians. So we're sending more force to put down the Whiskey rebels than we had sent to fight the Indians. And of course, this is something the folks in the West see. And Alexander Hamilton leads this army out west. The problem for the army is there really wasn't a rebellion going on. There were people who were resisting taxes, but they really simply wanted the Congress to rescind the excise tax, and they weren't trying to overthrow the government of the United States. So they arrest about 20 people, bring them back to Philadelphia for trial. All of them are acquitted except for 2 who actually were charged with other crimes. And you have the Whiskey Rebellion then put down, and Congress does lighten up on the excise taxes. This is a story for another day. And then the big thing, of course, the administration does is try to resolve the problems on the frontier that are caused by the British and the Spanish holding on to the Western Territory. So Washington sends John Jay, the Chief Justice, to negotiate with England. And in the treaty that Jay makes in 1795, the English agree they'll give up their forts in the West. And this is a huge thing for the Washington administration. Of course, if you are pro-French and you've been raising liberty poles and joining a Jacobin, well, they don't call them Jacobin societies, they call them Democratic Republican societies, and toasting the French Republic, you're going to see now we are making peace with England. And are we really neutral, or are we siding with the British? And then the other thing is the Washington sends Thomas Pinckney, a negotiator, to Spain. And the treaty with Spain gives the United States access to the Mississippi River. And the administration also makes peace with Algiers, Tripoli, and Tunis, these 3 North African states that have been capturing American ships. So you have the Washington administration taking action again to secure the border by getting access to the Mississippi River, giving Americans access to the Mediterranean by making peace with Algiers and Tripoli and Tunis, and then securing the Northwest by getting the British to agree to give up its forts in the Northwest. This is one reason why Anthony Wayne is able to defeat the Miami Indians when he goes out, because the British close their forts and won't let the Indians in after they've had a battle with the Americans. So you have the Washington administration doing this to secure the frontiers. Now, the treaty with England actually is not that popular among the supporters of France in the United States. And this is the party of Jefferson and Madison, who tend to like France more than they like England. And this is one of the huge problems here, is you have Americans divided by their support of France or support of England. These are the 2 great superpowers of the day. And It's unpopular in some areas. The Jay Treaty is unpopular in some areas. Remember, the Senate has to ratify treaties. And in this case, the Senate is definitely going to ratify the treaty because the Federalists control the Senate. However, the Republicans control the House of Representatives, or nearly do. And the House of Representatives now maintains it has a role in deciding whether treaties are created because they appropriate money. Again, this is another argument with our friend Madison saying that Congress gets to decide whether treaties are going into effect. Does anyone have an opinion on this? Told you what Madison thinks. And by the way, Madison continues thinking this until he's actually Secretary of State and then President. He does somewhat change his mind on executive power versus legislative power in terms of making foreign policy.
I'm sort of curious. So, were there still folks that were? It sounded like there were still a good many people who were interested in continuing some form of conflict with Britain even after. I guess I'm surprised if they were still carrying war debts and everything that they'd want to keep up any kind of fighting on the frontiers or anything.
It's not. It's a good question. It's not necessarily war debts, wanting to get back at England. It's changed because now England is at war with France, and France is the emblem of, France is a republic, and they're fighting against all kinds of monarchies. And we had this war against a monarchy, so we want to continue it. That is, England had been our enemy, and now they are the enemy of our friend, France. So you have that piece of it. You have both an ideological piece to it, that is, do you believe in the rights of man? Then you're going to support France. Do you believe in an established order? Then you're probably going to support England because the French have destroyed all established order in France. And now they want to continue destroying established order everywhere. So it's really kind of a spectrum we're on here. Do you want to support an established order, or do you want to begin the world anew? And it's that idea here. You see, it's not so much, boy, we still don't like England, we fought them back then. It's a new idea. Remember, Thomas Paine had gone off to France and he wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Man, which is what we're saying the French Revolution is all about. And if you support the rights of man, then of course you'd support the French. But if you think the French are really simply destroying established order, and if you agree with John Adams that that's going to lead to anarchy and ultimately political despotism, you're going to say, well, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't support the French. And remember, Washington has professed neutrality in this war between England and France. Even though the United States has made peace with England through Jay's Treaty, it doesn't commit the United States to support England in the war. The United States is still neutral in that war. But England is savvy enough to see that it's better to have the United States neutral than it is to say, hey, you need to come into the war on our side. And that's going to remain British policy for the next 20 years. That is, they don't want to force the United States to side with them against France. It's enough to say the United States has made a treaty with us to trade with us. And also, so we'll give up the Northwest because it's no good to us anyway. And so it's an interest. I'm not quite sure if this is answering your question or just obfuscating the entire issue about whose side people should be on. And the important thing here is that Washington doesn't want the United States to be on anyone's side. And the proponents of siding with the French or being against the English disagree, because they definitely want the United States to be on the side of France. So the party of Jefferson and Madison in Congress isn't saying, hey, we should be neutral. They're saying we really should support the French because they're against the English. And then the next step is to say the people who are against that simple proposition also want to create a monarchy here and want to change the republic into a monarchy by maintaining an established order or creating one. It's kind of a complicated thing. And what happens too in the wake of Jay's Treaty is France starts saying, hey, you know what? You're not really neutral. You're trading with England. Therefore, if we find one of your ships on the high seas, we can capture it because it's trading with the enemy. Back in 1790-91, when the United States was at war with Algiers, Algiers had captured a number of American merchant ships. And then in 1793, Algiers captured about a dozen more American merchant ships. And the United States decided at that moment to start building a navy. And this was kind of a controversial thing. The supporters of the administration liked the idea of a navy, even though navies are very expensive. The opponents were reluctant to spend the money on a navy for a variety of reasons. But the Navy, in this case, 6 ships were being built. And they're not all being built in the same place. The Washington administration was wise enough to say, okay, if we have one ship being built in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, one in Boston, one in New York, one in Philadelphia, one in Baltimore, one in Norfolk, that's going to divide up the work among these different places. And all of the ships are built by the same design, and they're bringing the materials to these different ports. One of these ships, by the way, is still around, still in commission in the Navy. It's the only one that still survives. The oldest commissioned warship afloat in the world. Does anyone know the name of this ship?
Isn't it the Constitution?
It is the USS Constitution, which is in the Charlestown Navy Yard. And every morning, if you're around, you can hear them fire their cannon at 8 in the morning, and then at sunset. Yes, oldest commissioned warship still afloat in the world. When it was being built in Boston, it was the largest structure in the town. It was the equivalent of an 11-story building. Massive investment in these ships. Washington gives them all their names, and then they're all under construction. Then in 1795, the United States made peace with Algiers, no longer a reason to build the ships, so they stopped building them. But now in 1797, the French are attacking American ships in the wake of Jay's Treaty. So we decide, okay, we're going to continue building this Navy because now we have a new enemy, the French. No, they haven't declared war on us. We don't declare war on them, but we know that we need to protect American merchant ships on the high seas. This is one of the problems here for the Washington administration. And I should say that by 1796, Washington is thoroughly tired of being president. He's been under attack by the opposition, which says he's trying to create a monarchy, and they don't understand what he is trying to do, and so he wants to retire. He had tried to retire earlier, actually in 1792. He said he didn't want to run again. And he mentioned this to James Madison and had Madison start drafting a farewell message for Washington. And Madison did write a farewell message for Washington. And then Washington had told Secretary of State Jefferson and Secretary of the Treasury Hamilton he was going to retire. And these two guys convinced Washington he has to stay. Jefferson, because he was afraid that if Washington left, Hamilton would have too much power. And Hamilton afraid that if Washington left, Jefferson's party would get too much power. These two guys are both still in the administration. And we haven't yet established that there are political parties. And in fact, most of the political leaders at the time didn't want to admit that there were political parties because parties tend to be bad things, or can be bad things. I should say Madison was really one of the few political thinkers of the time to say parties actually can serve a good purpose if they transcend regional lines. And Madison saw one of the big problems in the United States were these different areas that didn't have a strong connection. And in the farewell message he drafted for Washington, he talks about the benefits the different sections of the country get from their union. The North, the South, the West, the East, all have to be part of this same union. But now, for 4 years, Madison has been in Congress. He no longer really is Washington's closest advisor after 1792. And he is, in fact, the leader of an opposition in Congress. And Washington doesn't acknowledge that there can be a constitutional opposition to an elected government. And I'm not quite sure he is wrong. That is, Washington was elected. No one elected these, well, after the federal government puts down the Whiskey Rebellion, Washington, in his annual message to Congress, calls for a day of Thanksgiving because we've gotten over this big problem. But he also says we wouldn't have had this problem this severe if it hadn't been for certain self-created societies, these Democratic Republican clubs, which get together. They make all kinds of speeches that are published in the newspaper. They attack the government, and then people think, well, this is actually public opinion. Well, Washington says, well, wait a minute. We know what public opinion is because you elected the members of Congress. So Congress had voted for this excise law. Now you have all these self-created societies saying we don't like the excise law, and people take that as public opinion. It's quite similar to a Twitter mob. You know, you have all these people on Twitter. Well, maybe I'm not talking about anyone in particular, but you know, it seems to accelerate. And these self-created societies, Washington is saying, do that. We know who we know who Congress represents because they were elected. But who elected these guys to make toasts and have proclamations and, you know, put up liberty poles? And if you are turning over the power of government to these groups, these mobs who don't have any sanction by the law, what kind of government do you have? This, by the way, does, not surprisingly, provoke a discussion, not the least because the people in these self-created societies say Washington is all wrong. We, of course, have the power to tell the government what we think it should be doing. That's the only way you can have self-government, is to have people telling the government what it should be doing. Washington's view is you've elected these guys, presumably because you know what they're going to do, you should let them do it. You shouldn't then keep carping about what they should be doing once they're in power. By the way, this is still a reasonable enough discussion to have about what is the constraint on government, what is the force of public opinion in government. And Madison is one of the few to say, actually, these political divisions, or political parties as they're known, actually can form a salutary purpose. And then he goes further and says, we've always had political parties. We've just never really recognized them as such. In 1776, there was a political division over independence or remaining loyal. And he said, everyone remembers this because everyone was part of it. And then there was not really a national political division again until 1787, when there was a big national division over should we ratify the Constitution or not? And that created national political alliances. And then Madison said there was another creation of national political alliances in 1790 over the program proposed by the administration. Let's assume the state debts. Let's create a bank. This created a big political division, which was still persisting. And Madison sees the differences between what he calls anti-Republicans and Republicans. He's a Republican. The other side are anti-Republicans, which means they're against the Republic. And he said the antis are strong in influence, though weak in numbers. That is, he's painting them as the elite. Whereas he, of course, is the party of the people. He doesn't use the word the people because Madison also is somewhat distrustful of the people. So you have this argument going on about whether there should be political parties, whether political parties are good things. And just suffice it to say, the Washington administration does not recognize that it is part of a political party. Washington is president of the United States. The members of Congress are the Congress of the United States. And then you have the other side saying, well, actually, we are an opposition. And Washington is wondering, can there be an elected opposition to a government that's elected? It's not an easy question to figure out the answer to. And Washington is, as I said, is thoroughly tired of being president. And in 1796, no one can persuade him that he should stay. So he gets his farewell message out of the drawer and now gives it to Alexander Hamilton to punch up. And Hamilton does write more for Washington to have published in the newspaper in September of 1796, announcing that he is not going to be a candidate for re-election. It's actually printed toward the end of September. There are going to be state elections for electors, in some cases in November. The electors themselves are going to meet in the first week of December. So this is September, and Washington is announcing when the electors meet, I'm not a candidate. Imagine that. It's going to be just a matter of 2 months to find someone else. And Washington goes on. He does begin again, as Madison had suggested, with this whole wonderful idea about holding the nation together. And then he goes on to talk about what he sees as a big problem in the country, or a big series of problems in the country. And the biggest problem he sees is caused by this rise of faction. And he says all obstructions to the execution of the laws, all combinations and associations under whatever plausible character with the real design to direct, control, counteract, or awe the regular deliberation and action of the constituted authorities are destructive of this fundamental principle and of a fatal tendency, the fundamental principle of the right of the people to establish a government, which he says presupposes the duty of every individual to obey the established government. So we've established a government, you should let it govern. But then you have all these combinations to try to obstruct the government in what it's doing. They serve to organize faction, to give it an artificial and extraordinary force to put in the place of the delegated will of the nation, the will of a party, often a small but artful and enterprising minority of the community, and according to the alternate triumphs of different parties, to make public administration the mirror of the ill-concerted and incongruous projects of faction, rather than the organ of consistent and wholesome plans, digested by common councils and modified by mutual interests. That is, you already have all this discussion and all of these common councils and so on in this elected government. Why do you then need this extra force of faction here? However, combinations or associations of the above description may now and then answer popular ends, they are likely, in the course of things, to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion. And then he talks about the power of parties in the state and geographical problems. If there are parties formed on geographical distinctions, that's a very bad thing, something Madison had also said. But this spirit, the spirit of faction, is inseparable from our nature, having its root in the strongest passions of the human mind. It exists under different shapes in all governments, more or less stifled, controlled, or repressed. But in those of the popular form, it is seen in its greatest rankness and is truly their worst enemy. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. Without looking forward to an extremity of this kind, which nevertheless ought not to be entirely out of sight, the common and continual mischiefs of the spirit of party are sufficient to make it the interest and duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it. There is an opinion that parties in free countries are useful checks upon the administration of the government and serve to keep alive the spirit of liberty. This, within certain limits, is probably true. And in governments of a monarchical caste, patriotism may look with indulgence, if not with favor, upon the spirit of party. But in those of a popular character, in governments purely elective, it is a spirit not to be encouraged. From their natural tendency, it is certain there will always be enough of that spirit for every salutary purpose. And there being constant danger of excess, the effort ought to be, by force of public opinion, to mitigate and assuage it. A fire not to be quenched, it demands a uniform vigilance to prevent its bursting into a flame, lest instead of warming, it should consume. So Washington sees this spirit of party as allowing some small faction to exercise its will over the nation and will eliminate public liberty. It's really an ominous threat here hanging over the republic. And then he goes on to point out another real danger the United States has, which is that you have these two big superpowers contesting, and you have people in the United States divided by their allegiance or their support or their backing of either France or England. Nothing is more essential, he says, than that permanent, inveterate antipathies against particular nations and passionate attachments for others should be excluded, and that in place of them, just and amicable feelings toward all should be cultivated. The nation which indulges toward another an habitual hatred or an habitual fondness is in some degree a slave. It is a slave to its animosity or to its affection, either of which is sufficient to lead it astray from its duty and interest. That is, nations have their own duties and interests, which are not to help out, not to be caught up in an allegiance, a permanent allegiance with another nation. Against the insidious wiles of foreign influence, I conjure you to believe me, fellow citizens, the jealousy of a free people ought to be constantly awake, since history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of republican government. But that jealousy, to be useful, must be impartial, else it becomes the instrument of the very influence to be avoided, instead of a defense against it. Excessive partiality for one foreign nation and excessive dislike of another cause those whom they actuate to see danger only on one side and serve to veil and even second the arts and influence of the other. Real patriots who may resist the intrigues of the favorite are liable to become suspected and odious, while its tools and dupes usurp the applause and confidence of the people to surrender their interests. The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations, to have with them as little political connection as possible. So far, we have already formed engagements. Let them be fulfilled with perfect good faith. Here, let us stop. Europe has a set of primary interests, which to us have none, or a very remote relation. Hence, she must be engaged in frequent controversies, the causes of which are essentially foreign to our concerns. Hence, therefore, it must be unwise in us to implicate ourselves by artificial ties in the ordinary vicissitudes of her politics, or the ordinary combinations and collisions of her friendships or enmities. Why forego the advantages of okay, I'll read the paragraph before this. Our detached and distant situation invites and enables us to pursue a different course. If we remain one people under an efficient government, the period is not far off when we may defy material injury from external annoyance, when we may take such an attitude as will cause the neutrality we may at any time resolve upon to be scrupulously respected. When belligerent nations, under the impossibility of making acquisitions upon us, will not lightly hazard the giving us provocation, when we may choose peace or war as our interest, guided by justice, shall counsel. So Washington is looking ahead to a period of real independence for the United States if she can maintain this course. Why forego the advantages of so peculiar a situation? Why quit our own to stand upon foreign ground? Why, by interweaving our destiny with that of any part of Europe, entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambition, rivalship, interest, humor, or caprice? It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world, so far, I mean, as we are now at liberty to do it. For let me not be understood as capable of patronizing infidelity to existing engagements. Harmony, liberal intercourse with all nations are recommended by policy, humanity, and interest, and our commercial policy should hold an equal and impartial hand. There can be no greater error than to expect or calculate upon real favors from nation to nation. It is an illusion which experience must cure and which a just pride ought to discard. So this is a bit of Washington's farewell message published in a Philadelphia newspaper at the end of September in 1796. By the way, by the time this is printed in the paper, Washington is already on his way back to Mount Vernon. He's not hanging around Philadelphia. This is the first news people have that Washington is retiring. And this farewell message itself becomes one of the classic statements of American policy. And of course, Washington supporters take to it much more readily than those who have been in opposition. The address itself has an interesting history because during the Civil War in 1863, the Congress thought it would be useful. The Senate actually convenes on Washington's birthday, and a member of the Senate reads Washington's farewell message with its warning against excessive partisanship, the spirit of party, which is going to destroy liberty, and then the warning about foreign entanglements, which is a phrase Washington will use. And the Senate likes this tradition so much that they make it an annual event. And every year on the 22nd of February till this day, the Senate convenes and a member of the Senate is chosen to read Washington's farewell message. And initially, the senator would just sign his or her name in a book saying, I read Washington's farewell message. Since then, since really the 1940s, the senators have gone on at greater length about what it means to read Washington's farewell message. And you find some interesting members of the Senate who have read it. Henry Cabot Lodge, the senior, who was a PhD in history, read it when he was a senator. His grandson, also Henry Cabot Lodge, read it some 30 years later. In the 1950s, you had Barry Goldwater, the leading conservative in the late 20th century, read it one year. The following year, Hubert Humphrey, probably the leading liberal in the Senate, read it. John McCain read it. Others have read it. And the senators then have this message from Washington about avoiding partisanship and foreign entanglements. And then after the conclusion of the address, of course, the senators go back to what they have been doing. So I'm not quite sure the message has quite the effect that Washington had hoped it might. Now, the big news with Washington's message is there's going to be a contested election for the presidency. And essentially, there are two different political coalitions. There are, in fact, political factions, much as Washington wanted to avoid them. There is the faction or the group in favor of the administration and those who had opposed. And it's also fought against the backdrop of the French attacking American ships. And the two leading candidates for the office, of course, are John Adams, the vice president, and Thomas Jefferson, the former Secretary of State. And Adams gets 71 of the electoral votes. Jefferson gets 68. Now, each of these groups had decided on whom it would support for president. By the way, at this time, some states had the legislature choose the electors. This was true in New York and South Carolina and other states. So, however, whoever controlled the legislature would choose that state's presidential electors. In some, electors were chosen by congressional district. And there is some mechanism in each state to choose the electors. And then the electors vote in early December, as the electors still do, vote in early December in each of their state capitals. And the two people really leading the election or conducting it were Madison, who's a real organizer of the opposition. And this is why Thomas Jefferson is the candidate the opposition has chosen for its candidate. And in order to get support in New York, Aaron Burr is the guy they agree on to be their vice presidential candidate. Jefferson gets 68 electoral votes. Aaron Burr gets 30. The Virginia electors all vote for Samuel Adams and Thomas Jefferson. John Adams gets 71 votes. His vice presidential candidate is Thomas Pinckney, the guy who had created the treaty. And by the way, if you've wondered why there is a Pinckney Street on Beacon Hill, it is because of the Pinckneys of South Carolina. Beacon Hill was developed by Federalists this is why Mount Vernon is the main street on Beacon Hill, named, of course, for Washington's estate. And then the next street over is named for the Pinckney brothers, Charles Cotesworth and Thomas Pinckney. Kind of curious, they didn't name it for John Adams, but he was less popular among the Beacon Hill Federalists than the Pinckneys were. And so you have this contested election, which results in John Adams being elected president, and the next highest vote getter is Thomas Jefferson, who becomes vice president. And initially, it appears that these two guys might get along. In fact, Jefferson writes a congratulatory letter to John Adams saying, "You always preceded me in service and in honors, and it is only natural then you would precede me in being elected president." Now, before he sends this very conciliatory letter to Adams, he shows it to James Madison. And Madison says, "No, you can't send this letter, because then he'll take that to mean you're supporting him. And what happens if he changes his mind or something else?" And so the letter is never sent. Still, Adams recognizes that the big problem his incoming administration is going to have is the relationship with France. He knows he needs to send someone to negotiate with the French whom the French will respect. But he also knows he has to send someone who is not going to betray the interests of the United States. And the person he has in mind for this assignment is, of course, Thomas Jefferson. So a day or two before the inauguration, Jefferson and Adams meet, and Adams tells Jefferson, "I would like you to go to France to negotiate a treaty." And Jefferson says, "Though that would be a big mistake for the vice president to go negotiate treaties." And Jefferson had a good insight into the way this might work. There's a reason the president sends ambassadors and doesn't go off and negotiate things on his own. If the president, let's suppose the president sends Jake off to negotiate a treaty and Jake botches it, well, then he can just send someone else. But if the president himself is gone and doesn't succeed, what can he do? He'd be kind of stuck. You can't say, "But I'll send someone better." So Jefferson said sending the vice president would be tantamount to the president going, and you really need to send someone else. And so then Adams says, "Well, how about Madison?" Because Adams knows he needs to send someone who is on the other side politically, because the French won't accept anyone who is a Federalist. And Jefferson says, "Well, I'll talk to Madison." Madison, by the way, had not run for re-election. He had recently married a vivacious widow named Dolly Payne, and he was going to go home to Virginia to enjoy married life. And when Jefferson talks to Madison, he's not wild about going to France. By the way, Madison never left the country. Meanwhile, Adams talks to the members of his cabinet. Now, he had kept in place all of the same people who had been in Washington's cabinet. These were, and by the end of Washington's administration, the main criteria you had for being in the cabinet was Hamilton approved you. So these guys have been in the cabinet. They've been under almost constant attack, as they see it, from Madison and the Republicans. And now Adams tells, I think, Secretary of State Pickering, or maybe Secretary of the Treasury Wolcott, I'm thinking of sending Madison to negotiate with the French. And Wolcott, as Adams puts in his diary, stuck out his lower lip. I thought he was going to start crying. And he said, Mr. President, we're all prepared to resign. That is, you're sending the guy from the other side to negotiate. Why do you have us around? So Adams doesn't want them to resign. And so he realized he couldn't send a Republican to lead the negotiations with the French. And by the way, Madison had already said he didn't want to go. So Adams does send 3 negotiators to the French, 3 who are palatable, at least, to the his administration. One is Charles Coatsworth Pinckney, who already was there, and in fact, the French had refused to receive him. Another is John Marshall, senator from Virginia, and the third is Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts. Now, Gerry is a Republican, but he's someone Adams has known for about 30 years and someone Adams trusts. So you have 3 negotiators who go off to France, and then nothing happens. No one reports back about what's happening with the French are still attacking American ships on the high seas. And if you are in the opposition, that is, if you are one of the Jeffersonians, you know the reason the administration has failed to make peace with the French. Does anyone know why the administration has failed to make peace with the French? If you are reading, say, the Philadelphia Aurora or the Massachusetts Gazette or one of the other Republican papers. Why won't the French want to make a treaty with the United States?
Because the United States didn't help France in the French Revolution.
That's right, because the United States wouldn't help France in the French Revolution, and because we know that John Adams really doesn't like the French Revolution. In fact, he wants to establish a monarchy, and the French are on to this. And the people he sent to negotiate don't appreciate the French. They're all these arch federalists who want to establish a monarchy, and naturally, our friends, the French, aren't going to want to make a treaty with the United States, because by not helping the French, we are actually on the side of England. So you have this constant litany in the Republican press about how inept the Adams administration is. And it's the belligerent policy of John Adams, this pig-headed guy who can't listen to reason, and he's a big bully, and other things they're saying about him. I know it's difficult to conceive of the press attacking a president in this way, but they see Adams as really the problem here. And this is why, naturally, our friends, the French, aren't going to make a treaty as long as this buffoon is running things here and siding with the English because he wants to be the Duke of Braintree and establish a monarchy. So this is kind of what's happening in the Republican press. This is constant attacks on the administration. And the French, of course, are justified in attacking us. I think if Washington were at home reading the papers, he would say, this is exactly what I was warning against. And then in March of 1798, a series of dispatches arrive on a ship from France reporting on the negotiations. And then the administration refuses to release these dispatches. Well, why aren't they releasing them? This is exactly a year from Adams taking office. Now we've gotten the first word back from the these envoys he sent, and he won't release these documents. He says they're being translated. Now, this, of course, gives us who have been saying the reason he hasn't succeeded with the French is because of his ineptitude, to say the reason he's not releasing the documents is they prove his ineptitude. Why else would he withhold the documents? Then by the 19th of March, the documents are translated, and Adams sends them to Congress with a message that says, I will never send another negotiator to France unless he will be treated as the representative of a free people. Because these documents tell something of a different story. The reason these three negotiators hadn't gotten anywhere, they went to the French Foreign Ministry, and there first they were met by a Monsieur X. They didn't want to give his name because the story you are about to hear will make you feel utter contempt for this French official. Monsieur X said, before you go to see my superior, that is Monsieur Y, you're going to need to give me 50,000 francs. And Monsieur Y will want 50,000 francs before he sends you to Monsieur Z, who is the French foreign minister. We kind of can guess that Monsieur Z is Talleyrand, the French foreign minister, who will want 150,000 francs. So essentially, you are going to need to bribe us to the tune of $250,000. Also, we want a loan of $12 million because we're fighting the English. So it's not that the Adams administration was inept and our friends, the French, see through John Adams's pig-headed belligerence. It's because the French are demanding bribes before they do anything. And according to tradition, our Charles Coatsworth Pinckney, when said you need to pay up 50,000 francs, said not a sixpence. And when John Marshall arrives back home with this news, he's greeted with banners that say, millions for defense, not 1 cent for tribute. And in the wake of this, by the way, this makes you, if you've been one of these anti-Adams Republicans, look really idiotic, as well as malevolent. You've been defending these group of bribe solicitors. And so what Congress does in the wake of this is decide it needs to get serious about the threat from France. It creates a navy. The ships that had been built beginning back in 1793 were under the War Department, but now we create a separate department of the Navy. And we also raise an army of 50,000 men, a provisional army to protect the country against the French attack. And the Congress also proposes a series of laws to prevent the French agents from circulating around the country. These are the Alien Friends Act. If you're an alien from a country that's at peace with the United States and the president determines you're dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States, you can be deported. This is really aimed at one certain group. These are mainly Irish people. And a lot of Irish had come here. A lot of the newspapers I've mentioned are being run by Irish guys. And of course, Ireland is part of Great Britain. We're at peace with Britain. So you are an alien friend, an alien from a country at peace. If you're an alien enemy, that is, you're an alien from a country at war with the United States, you can be deported whether you pose any threat or not. There's also a Naturalization Act, which extends from 5 years to 15 years, the period you have to live in the United States before you can become a citizen. And there is a Sedition Act, which if you write, publish, or utter, or cause to be written, published, or uttered, something that will bring the president, a member of Congress, or into contempt, hatred, or ridicule, you can be jailed for a year and fined $1,000. By the way, there is one federal official not protected by the Sedition Act, and that's the vice president. If you want to criticize Thomas Jefferson, have at it. But saying anything that might bring President Adams or a member of Congress into contempt, hatred, or ridicule is a federal offense. Let me see, just briefly, I was going to mention some other important aspect of this. Okay. Any questions on this? I should say the Naturalization Act is kind of an interesting one. When Madison left Congress, the leader of the opposition, or leadership of the opposition, falls to one of the most important statesmen in the history of the country, and this is Albert Gallatin. And Gallatin, a congressman from Western Pennsylvania, he had gotten his start in politics during the whole crisis over whiskey. He was a voice for moderation, but also an opponent of the excise tax. And unlike just about all of the other Republicans, Gallatin understood something about finance. So he always was the guy who would write the pamphlet or write the answer to Hamilton's proposals, because he understood how finance works, unlike a lot of the other Republicans who were Virginia planters. Gallatin represented Western Pennsylvania, but he was originally from Switzerland. He had come to the United States sometime in the 1780s, left Switzerland. His aunt who raised him was a friend of Voltaire. He has a letter of introduction from Benjamin Franklin, arrives in Cambridge and briefly teaches French at an institution in that particular community, and then migrated out to Western Pennsylvania and tried to start a glass factory that didn't work, but he gets into politics. And now he is the Republican leader in Congress. And he speaks with a very thick French accent. Imagine the optics of this. The opposition is saying, we're not kind enough to the French. Their leader in Congress speaks with a French accent. You can kind of see how that's not going to, if there were television in this period, I don't think the opposition would have lasted very long. Now, the Naturalization Act comes into play here because we're not sure exactly when Gallatin arrived and when he took an oath as a new arrival in the state of Virginia. Was it 16 years ago or was it 14 years ago? Think about this. If Gallatin's only been here for 14 years, the new Naturalization Act says you have to be here for 15 years. We could say he's actually not a citizen. And then since he's from a country at war with the United States, he left France to come here, he could be deported. What a great tactic that would be. Now, the Sedition Act is something different. Well, actually, we're almost out of time. I'm just warming up with the Sedition Act. And I'm ready. I think I'm just going to stay here talking to myself about it for the rest of the night. Let me say one thing about the podcasts. You came up with a great name for the podcast as a whole, Revolutionary Rams. That's the title. Thank the group who coined that phrase. You did a good job. And I am hoping you're all working on your podcasts, which will really revolutionize the airwaves and will give us a good reason to talk more about the Sedition Act next time. So come back next time and we'll hear what happens with the Sedition Act and the Alien Acts, the war with France. Things look really bad. Will the country survive? These are the questions I'm asking at the end of every class. So see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take
See you,
care.
Professor.
Great.
You-